On January 21, 1968, the Arctic sky above northwestern Greenland looked calm. Flat grey light, bitter wind, nothing moving for miles. Then, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber, carrying 4 thermonuclear weapons, caught fire in the air. The crew fought it, lost control, and bailed out over Baffin Bay. The aircraft crashed onto the sea ice near Thule Air Base, today known as Pituffik Space Base. There was no nuclear detonation, but the conventional explosives in the weapons ruptured the components. Radioactive material scattered across ice and snow in a wide debris field, mixing with burning fuel in a place where almost nothing should burn. The cleanup operation, Project Crested Ice, ran for months. Hundreds of people worked in extreme cold, scraping contaminated snow, packing debris into containers, loading it onto ships, trying to make the Arctic forget what had happened. And for the public, that's the story. An accident, a cleanup, a scandal. But in truth, that crash is the doorway into something much larger. Because the real question isn't how a plane went down. The real question is why, in the first place, the United States was flying bombers armed with nuclear weapons over a Danish territory on the far edge of the world, day after day, year after year. To answer that, you have to go backward. Back before the crash. Back before the Cold War turned hot in men's minds. Back to a decision that made Greenland one of the most important pieces of ground on Earth, without ever changing a single border on a map. In April 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark. The Danish government surrendered quickly under overwhelming force. But in Washington, Denmark's ambassador did something almost unheard of. Henrik Kaufmann refused to accept that Denmark's government could act freely under occupation. He treated Copenhagen's orders as the commands of a hostage. And in 1941, Kaufmann signed an agreement with the United States that allowed American forces to establish defensive facilities in Greenland. It was a dramatic act of diplomacy, one that Denmark could not fully control while it remained under German occupation. In practical terms, it gave the United States a legal entry point into Greenland's strategic space before the war had even ended. So by the time the Second World War finally closed, the Americans weren't looking at Greenland as a distant unknown. They were looking at it like a place they had already begun to shape. Which brings us to the winter of 1946. Picture Washington in the first winter after victory. The war is over, but peace feels thin, like ice that hasn't fully frozen. Harry Truman is president now. The United States has the bomb. The Soviet Union is no longer an ally. It's the next problem. American planners are staring at geography with a new kind of fear. Because if the unthinkable ever happens, Greenland isn't far away. It's in the middle. In 1946, Secretary of State James F. Burns delivered a U.S. proposal to Denmark's foreign minister, Gustav Rasmussen, $100 million in gold bullion in exchange for Greenland. This wasn't a casual suggestion. The Joint Chiefs had already labeled Greenland essential for American defense planning. And the offer wasn't just large, it was designed to feel undeniable, not currency, not promises, gold, a hard asset in a Europe still shattered by war. To American strategists, it made sense. Greenland sat on the emerging geometry of a nuclear age. It could host early warning systems, long runways, and the kind of infrastructure you only build when you believe a future war might be measured in minutes. But Denmark said no, not loudly, not theatrically, just firmly enough to make the point. And in that rejection, the relationship between the United States and Greenland didn't end. It changed shape. If the United States couldn't buy Greenland outright, it could still secure what it needed: access, permanence, and control of critical facilities. In 1951, Denmark and the United States signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement. It granted the US broad rights to build and operate military installations in Greenland. This is the pivot. The map stayed Danish. But the strategic reality shifted, and soon the most important American installation in the Arctic began to rise on the permafrost. Thule Air Base, renamed Pituffik Space Base in 2023, became an anchor point for missile warning, missile defense, and space surveillance. That renaming matters because it tells you what Greenland became. Not just a Cold War listening post, a platform for the space domain, a forward sensor, a fixed point in a place where everything else moves. In 1959, the US Army announced an Arctic research station, Camp Century. The public story was scientific ambition, testing how humans could build and live inside an ice cap. Engineers carved a network of tunnels under the Greenland ice sheet, built living quarters, a dining hall, even installed a nuclear reactor to power the facility. But Camp Century's research mission was a cover story. Declassified documents later tied it to a far larger concept, Project Iceworm, an attempt to explore whether the US could hide a missile network under the ice, moving launch positions through tunnels so the Soviets could never target them. The plan was staggering in scale, thousands of miles of tunnels, up to hundreds of missiles in a roaming deployment system beneath the ice. And here's the detail that matters for the story of Greenland. This wasn't just a military project. It was a demonstration of mindset. The United States wasn't treating Greenland as a remote ally's territory. It was treating it as a controllable environment, a place where you could build the unimaginable, quietly, because no one lived nearby and the world rarely looked north. Iceworm ultimately failed because the ice itself wouldn't cooperate. The Greenland ice sheet moves and deforms, crushing tunnels over time. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. But the lesson remained. Greenland could be used, deeply, aggressively, without ever formally owning it. And that reality set the stage for the crash we started with. When the B-52 went down in 1968, it didn't just scatter debris across Arctic ice, it exposed contradictions. Denmark had a public posture against nuclear weapons on its territory. Yet, US nuclear missions operated in and around Greenland, culminating in an accident that could not be hidden. The cleanup, Project Crested Ice, became a massive operation. Months of work, thousands of samples, contaminated material shipped out, and political damage that lingered. But even that scandal didn't change the underlying logic. Greenland remained essential. Denmark still needed American protection. The United States still needed Arctic reach. So the partnership held, quietly, imperfectly, and with memories Greenlanders would carry for decades. And then, for a moment, it looked like the urgency might fade. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. The Arctic became a backdrop again, until the ice started to change. In the 21st century, Greenland's strategic value didn't disappear, it multiplied, because the Arctic is no longer just a military frontier, it's becoming infrastructure. New routes open as ice recedes, shortening connections between continents. Greenland sits beside those evolving corridors, close enough to matter in logistics, search and rescue, and military planning. At the same time, the definition of critical infrastructure changed. It's not only airspace and sea lanes. It's information. Undersea cables carry the bulk of modern communications, financial data, civilian traffic, military coordination. And as undersea systems become a focus of competition, attention returns to Arctic-adjacent waters. Russian specialty vessels have been reported operating near telecommunications cables, and the ship Yantar has been associated in reporting with activity near undersea cable routes. This is why Greenland's location matters again, even if no missiles ever launch from its soil. In a crisis, Cutting or disrupting undersea infrastructure can create chaos without firing a shot. The Arctic, once seen as empty, is increasingly treated as a zone where the nervous system of modern life can be monitored or threatened. And that's only half of the new story. The other half is buried in rock. Greenland is not just ice, it is geology. In southern Greenland, the Illimausak complex contains significant mineral resources, including rare earth elements. Sites like Kvanefjeld and Tanbreez have attracted international attention because these materials are vital for modern technology and defense supply chains. Rare earth elements matter because they sit inside the machines of the future: motors, sensors, guidance, systems, and advanced electronics. But Greenland's mineral promise comes with a complication that reshaped politics overnight. At Kvanefjeld, rare earths occur alongside uranium. That link makes extraction politically explosive in a place that fears radioactive contamination and values environmental protection. Greenland's uranium mining ban, enacted in 2021, has had direct consequences for projects where uranium is co-located with other minerals. Now the story becomes human again. Because for Greenlanders, minerals are not just revenue. They are identity, risk, and sovereignty. And for great powers, minerals are leverage, which is where China enters the modern chapter. For years, China has pursued influence, not only through military basing, but through financing and infrastructure, ports, roads, terminals, and logistics. Greenland had an inflection point like that. In 2018, a Chinese firm, China Communications Construction Company, was bidding on Greenland Airport construction projects. Denmark stepped in with financing support to reduce the pull of Chinese involvement. To Greenland, airports are more than concrete. They are connectivity. They change tourism, supply lines, medical evacuation, the ability to function with less reliance on Denmark. To Washington, airports are also something else: access, presence, and potential dual-use infrastructure. So this wasn't a local procurement debate. It was a strategic signal. It said Greenland was becoming the kind of place where major powers compete quietly over who builds the future. And by 2019, that quiet competition collided with something loud. In August 2019, when Donald Trump reportedly asked about buying Greenland, the world treated it like a prank. But that question didn't come out of nowhere. It emerged from the accumulated logic of 70 years. The US had tried to buy Greenland once before. It had secured strategic rights without ownership through treaty. It had built bases, experimented under the ice, and endured the consequences of nuclear-era operations. And now, with the Arctic warming and strategic competition rising, Greenland was becoming a convergence point again. Space, sea, minerals, logistics. Trump's phrasing was blunt, but the underlying pressure was real, not because the United States expected Denmark to sell, but because asking the question was a way of admitting something that had become difficult to ignore. Greenland sits at the intersection of too many priorities to be left to drift. And yet, in 2019, the world had one crucial difference from 1946. Greenland itself had a stronger voice. Greenland is self-governing within the Kingdom of Denmark, with control over many domestic matters. And in modern Greenland politics, the question of resource extraction has become inseparable from the question of independence. Denmark provides substantial financial support through its block grant. Independence advocates see resources as a path to economic self-sufficiency. But the uranium connection at Kvanefjeld forced a national decision. In 2021, Greenland reinstated a uranium mining ban after sustained local opposition, affecting projects tied to uranium-bearing deposits. That one decision did more than halt a mine. It sent a message to every capital watching. Greenland was not a blank space. It was a political actor. A small one, yes, but sitting on assets the world's largest economies want. Assets that shape supply chains, defense production, and industrial policy. And this is where the story becomes a choice, not a prediction. Because Greenland is not only the stage, Greenland is the decision-maker that everyone is trying to influence. So here is the real story of Greenland. Not a purchase offer, not a headline, not a meme. A long arc of strategy that runs from World War II diplomacy to Cold War experiments under the ice, to modern competition over minerals, logistics, and space. A story where borders stay the same, while power arrangements shift underneath them. And as Greenland moves into the next decade, 3 questions will shape everything. First, who builds the infrastructure? Airports, ports, communications, energy. Whoever finances and builds them doesn't just create development, they create leverage. Second, who controls the mineral future? Not just the rock in the ground, but the processing capacity, the contracts, the supply chains that turn ore into components. Third, who sets the terms of security? Greenland's bases are no longer only about bombers. They are about missile warning, space surveillance, and the Arctic as a theater where minutes matter. And that brings us back to the image we began with, fire on ice in 1968. Not as a relic, as a reminder. Because Greenland has always been the kind of place where global powers test what they can do far from the world's attention. The difference now is that the attention is returning, and Greenland is no longer silent. So the next time you see Greenland on a map as a white mass at the top of the world, don't think of it as empty. Think of it as contested. Not by armies marching across borders, but by treaties, infrastructure bids, resource policy, and strategic presence. In the mid-20th century, the question was, how do you defend North America? In the 21st century, the question is sharper. Who gets to shape the Arctic future, and who gets to live with the consequences? Because Greenland can't be bought like a piece of property. But it can be pressured, it can be courted, it can be surrounded by competing promises. And the final answer won't be signed in Washington. It will be decided, slowly, politically, and locally, by the people who live on the edge of the ice.